I wouldn't say there was a single point. There were a lot of epiphanies on the way as I started delving deeper that it's a systems problem. You have to just like go through 400 research papers and talk to probably 1,000, not 1,000, but at least 50 bakers from India and across the world to reach that point.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Breaking Uneven podcast. We love to talk shop, uncover the beauty of failures, and play a few games. We have with us Anushka Neol of 3-1 Farms with us today. Anushka, how's Mumbai treating you?
Well, very well. I slept for 11 hours for the first time ever in the 2 or 3 years I've been here, on and off every once in a while.
Anushka, after interning in marketing, research, and HR, you went to ISP for economics and management. After that, you founded Nurture Baby Spa, a baby wellness company, worked as an associate at Sumeru Ventures, and then project management for Sumeru Inc. After that, you became a full-time entrepreneur again with Oud Living and now 3-1 Farms. That's quite the roller coaster, and we're going to delve a little bit more into it. But have you covered your journey well so far?
Well researched, I would say.
Okay, yeah. Perfect. So to delve a little bit deeper into 3-1 Farms, we're going to play a quick little game.
So this game is called the Twitter Pitch Challenge. Twitter is known for its 280 character limit on every tweet, which sometimes makes it a little difficult to convey your thoughts. And so that's the challenge that we transfer to you. It takes 20 seconds to speak 280 characters, and you need to explain to us 3-1 Farms in 20 seconds. But it's not that easy. You also need to use one emoji and one hashtag.
I see.
Got it?
Yeah, for
Cool.
sure.
So we're going to show you a timer to intimidate you a bit. And you have 20 seconds. 3, 2, 1, go.
3-1 Farms is an agricultural enterprise trying to create social impact while curating farm-to-table global standard specialty grain flours to combat climate change. Hashtag would be world, the earth emoji, and the emoji would be the earth emoji, and the hashtag would be food systems change.
It went above. We got 27 seconds. But to be fair, she did get done with the tweet without the hashtag and emoji within the 20 seconds.
A lot of words.
But yeah, I guess before we get to 3-1 Farms, you've interned quite a bit across different roles. What was your experience along these internships? How were they for you?
So quite frankly, because I come from an agricultural background, and the place I come from, it's sort of a ritual that while kids are young, just send them to boarding school for better education. And I think that's what our parents did for us. So I spent 6 to 7 years in Jaipur in a boarding school. I studied science, so I had PCM and economics. And because I didn't fare well with science, like chemistry was my favorite subject on why I took science. Just to be in the chemistry lab is why I took that subject, like the entire stream. But it was very, very clear by the end of school that science is not really what I want to pursue. And economics felt like the easiest subject at that point in time. So I was like, why not economics and business management? And went to Delhi, studied at ISPF, which is Indian School of Business and Finance. It's a University of London International Programs affiliate center. So that's what happened. And I was this kid among a lot of people from Delhi and around who all came from business families, and I had very little context. So up until the first 2 years, I'd always been this nerdy first bencher, topper, that sort of a person. And by the, I would say, end of first year, the goal really was that any internship that could come my way, I would do it. And it became very methodical after that. Whatever subject I would study in the year, I would want to do whatever my favorite subject of the year would be. I would want to do an internship in that field. So it started with being a social media intern at the end of first year. Then I would not go back home for a summer or a winter break. I'd do an internship. Then I did like a research internship at this NGO called Consumer India. And that was around junk food and its impact. The next one was HR. So I worked at ABC Consultants, and we did hiring for Grofers at the time. I was very proud of it. So this sort of kept going on, these internships. Whatever is the favorite subject, you have to learn a little bit about it from the practical side of things. But it was really the third year where there was the subject called e-business. And I think we had the best professor. It was a 70-year-old man who's had this long life journey of working in the field, but eventually came into academia. And he would constantly encourage us. And I was sort of the favorite student. and at that point in time, it sort of also became clear that I don't think I'm meant to do a job. Like, the consulting business really didn't excite me, while all my friends were going for these exchange programs and all the big fours and big threes and all of that. And then my personal journey sort of also started coming into picture. We're 4 siblings. I'm the eldest, and with my brother, I have a 15-year age gap.
Wow.
So I always felt like a pseudo parent. So 3 sisters and then a brother. So starting school time, because I was in the boarding, so every time we'd go back home, I'd get something for him. And it would be like, okay, what do you get for a little child, right? And I would do a lot of research, what could help a child with their growth milestones, and what could be the books, what could be the toys, what could be the clothing, and things like that. And I was really involved in his growth journey from my perspective, for sure. And it was around that time this idea of doing a baby spa came into picture. And it was an exercise, really, like a 2 to 3 month period where I want to do something. I used to be that person. If you'd go to a mall and you've seen a baby, I'd be like, I want to go and say hi. If you're seeing a child having an ice cream, you'd just go seek their parents' permission and will want to spend 2 minutes with them, asking them about ice cream. So that sort of a thing. So I was sure it's going to be childcare. But what could you do for, young children? And this idea of that early growth milestones, how do you achieve them? Started researching, found out that the concept of baby spas is a thing. And this is still second year of college. We're just doing internships and figuring things out. And by the end of third year, it just became clear that I have to have the startup running and going at it. And it was, I think it was also the time when the startup ecosystem was developing. I'm talking 2015, 16. And staying in the Delhi environment, seeing the kind of people around me was fairly exciting. And a few of my friends also in the college had done their student startups. So it was sort of that climate that enabled it. But right out of college, you just don't start. So I started working with an events company. We managed weddings and all sorts of events that could happen. What could be the vendor? So, I mean, a lot of these skill sets came from these internships and tiny little gigs here and there. Did that for 2 months, and again, same conclusion. I can't work for someone else. And then I was like, okay, we need to do it. And one of my college friends was my co-founders in the baby spa. Now, even doing that was, we're going to do everything from scratch. We did not import any baby pools. In fact, I went to Okhla, sat in the factory 6 months straight with our manufacturer, right? Okay, this is something in China, this is something in UK, how they do the pools, can you do it? And he thought I was some school student, probably out of 12th grade, who has this idea. But yeah, we made our own hydrotherapy pools. We invited expert trainers from Japan and Switzerland to give training in infant massage, and very, very scientifically. The first 1,000 days are very, very critical to a human baby's growth. That's where the brain is growing the fastest. You're developing 1,000 neurons a second. that is sort of the speed, and that speed never gets achieved ever in a human's lifetime. And that's where you can make the most impact. That's where your attachment behavior as an adult, so these are those formative years decide a lot of stuff. So yeah, hired people, like wherever I had interned, I activated those contacts. So we went on hiring people through ABC Consultants, and we were acting like it's a corporate company and everything has to be like, not the startup jugaad way, and I have a way of saying it, like we were trying to build Taj Mahal, but we didn't know we were the workers whose hands would be cut. But yeah, so that was really this very in-depth experience, doing everything from scratch. Even the space that we built, 3,000 square feet, it was a bare space. I learned everything on how to even do the interiors. We had a design agency, we worked with them very, very closely. Brought in people who'd worked as infant massage or massage therapists at Oberoi's and Taj, who had to be mothers as well, because I was all in all 20 years old. So I had to compensate for that by compensate for not being a mother, by having enough medical scientific knowledge, by having the right team, the right people, and creating that right systems and processes, that when you come in, so many people ask that which brand is this, like, are you a franchisee of a global brand? So we were really happy that we could achieve that. However, from a business standpoint, we lost all the money. It didn't really fly out. We had like a runway of probably 8 months. It was a bootstrapped venture, and we realized that everyone loves the concept. However, culturally, we were way too ahead. We were the first baby spa in India, and in North, grandparents were like, why do you need to put a child in water at 1 month's age? What we were trying to mimic the environment that a baby gets in the uterus, which is a liquid environment, and they feel comforted, and they're usually overstimulated as children. And we were trying to help them have better digestion, get better with colic and gas issues, and overall the health and, the muscle and the bone development, the brain development. But yeah, that was a long one.
Yeah, no, I think that in India especially, like anything to do with like babies and stuff like that, it's very cultural as well. Like even though you're saying like massaging and stuff like that, like most families do get like malish valis at home and help like the kid and stuff like that. So a lot of it is ingrained, but it's just, I guess, the thought process of sending the kid somewhere else to get it done versus it being done at your house that I guess you were combating.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to explain it to someone that it could be very, very scientific in nature, using the principles of yoga, using the principles of adult massage therapy as well, and using the principles of acupuncture as well. And I mean, just a basic thing, when you start massaging anyone, you have to all the movements have to be towards the heart. That's what increases the blood flow, that increases the oxygen flow in the brain, and that it releases certain hormones, right? And when you're ending the massage, you have to massage away from the heart to relax and calm down and end the process, and just to build those initial boundaries of what healthy touch is. Like, massage is not supposed to be painful. Children are not supposed to cry. They're supposed to feel super relaxed and sleep after that. So there were a lot of elements. It's very, very nuanced. And so it was a lot to take on.
Yeah, for sure. But yeah, I guess like you went back and forth between starting things and then having jobs.
So that happened. We closed it down, and I was like, maybe our full 3,000 square feet store, the unit economics did not work. Let's try to open it in a store-in-store format. And there was a play area on the 4th floor in the same mall. I'm talking Golf Course Road, DLF5 in Gurgaon. It was called Monkey Business, and Gagan was a dear friend because we were opening at the same time. And I was like, can I try a store-in-store format? He's like, why not? Again, then we realized that it's like a seasonal business. It's like ice creams, If monsoon is there, people will not send babies out. If it's winters, because our environment was temperature regulated. The water was temperature regulated. After every therapy, we would flush out 400 liters of water, clean it, and refill it. So as you can understand, the workings of the business were very, very intricate. And yeah, so that did not work out. And that really was the time when one of my friends, he'd seen all the work through LinkedIn and Instagram. He was like, I'm working with a venture capital fund based out of US, but it's an Indo-US thing. Would you like to sort of come over and do this? And I started working with them. Then I was working with LPs, managing those relationships, getting on board, doing a little bit of content here and there. I was like, no, this is very repetitive. This is not for my brain. Then they had another arm which was into marketing. So I was like, I'll be happy to do corporate branding projects, handle the clients, end-to-end project management. I'm a very like people's person. So I need a lot of novelty in the work. So that really helped. But around the same time, it's like once you've tasted the blood, you can't go back, right? The thrill of it all. And I was researching day in, day out new ideas. So there were ventures, like there were folders on my desktop on what's next. There was like urban honey.
Literally the same. It's so funny. I call like the main folder Project Unemployed. And then I had new idea folders and then all of it just to be like, okay, like what research or everything that I would do, and I put it in that folder and things like that. It's just like so funny, but yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, those folders were really, I got into avocado, so I called the venture Lovocado. And I created a Facebook community, started researching about that. Then there was another one because our family farms, we have quinoa orchards as well. Quinoa is a mandarin that's specifically grown in Punjab. And my region is responsible for 65% of Punjab's production. And because it was into the family, I was like, why can't I have this Zumix machine from Spain? And it's like automated juicer. I'll put it in all the WeWorks of the world. And like, you know, you have fresh juice. But it was, again, so seasonal. Then I was like, okay, why can't we make honey in urban environments? So why can't we have like these urban terraces and people will have their fresh honey and you're reviving the biodiversity in some sense. That was another one. Then we grow cotton as well in that area. Our family, that agro area. And I was like, what do you do with the biomass, the leftover residue? So you make pellets and it's used as biofuel. So these were the folders. I didn't know that I was going to get into agriculture. But a lot of these ideas revolved around what already existed in the ecosystem that I come from. And around the same time in 2019, this black wheat was released. Like hugely marketed, right? The Indian wheat for anyone suffering from sedentary lifestyle, diabetes, cardiac issues, and because it's rich in antioxidants, that's where the black color comes from. Similarly, where the blueberries blue come from, right? And I was like, this is the future of wheat, right? And I was in Delhi, no plans to go back. Around September of 2019, I go to Pragati Maidan Trade Fair. That's where I found out about them, met the scientist, understood a little bit of it. And I was like, Dad, I'm sending you some seed. Just grow it in 2 acres. It's going to change everything. And little did I know that the pandemic will come in 2020. I'll be going back home. I'll be the one selling that black wheat. And it's actually really going to change things.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was completely unbelievable how it happened. But so yeah, fast forward, April 2020, around that time, parents were really scared because me and my sisters, we were living in Delhi just by ourselves. 3 of us hadn't stepped out really in 2 months. They were like, you girls, just come back home. We are getting anxiety attacks every single day. And finally, we moved back in July 2020 and did not think that it would be a permanent move even then. But yeah, when I saw that black wheat lying around, I was like, this is on me. And till that point in time, I didn't know that you can't sell this in mandi. Because it was marketed as that, oh, it is going to sell for a certain price point, which is almost 1.5x the commodity prices, but it was not sold. And that's where I was like, oh, all right, I will sell this. And I made this Instagram account. We called our farms 3-1 Farms. From the very, very beginning, probably 10 years, 6-7 years, we had named it. Like, you know, what would you call your family farm?
Why 3-1?
Well, that's an interesting one.
Because 3 sisters.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah? Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Good.
That's the scratch. Like you're just scratching on the surface with that.
Okay.
So we'll come to that story. I have a good one for that. So I just made that handle, started reaching out to people. Within 2 months, sent 100 samples out, and the pitch was simple. I am a farmer. We have this black wheat flour. It's good for people with all these lifestyle issues, and this is the research paper. Will you please read it, and can I
Where
send?
do you get the research paper from?
It was published online, right? When you release any wheat variety, there's a research paper put out for public on that. It's a mandate to release any variety, you have to put some data out. So that happened, and I was sending everyone that link and all the articles which were published on it. As I told, it was heavily marketed. So it wasn't that there was any scarcity of information on that wheat. And within 2 months, 100 samples out, I thought people would be baking chapatis or like things which were simpler in some sense. I had no clue what a sourdough was. I didn't know what gluten was. And people coming back to me asking what's the hydration percentage, what's the gluten percentage we should put in it. And I'm blank. I was like, let me go back to the drawing board and tell you, because they were actually baking really good stuff with it and fermenting the flour. But that was really what got me into it, because as I told you, I love chemistry. So I started delving a little bit deeper into things, and this is all going on. And even oud that time, when I moved back to the farm, so black wheat was for sure a thing. But at the same time, I was like, let's do something else as well. Because pandemic, everyone was wearing face masks and there were a lot of face acne. And I'd suffered from them myself. So silk is this natural fabric that's thermoregulating, hypoallergenic, and you wouldn't. Yeah. So that's how we got into silk accessories. So pure mulberry silk, we would do accessories with it, and it was the hot selling thing at the time. But it was very, very clear even at that point that at some point in time I'll have to part with one to scale the other. But because both were going on, they were really small scale things that I was doing out of passion. Then 7-8 months down the line in 2021, when the pandemic was like a little slowed down, I didn't know who Daniel Trulson was up until that point. However, someone said, do you know Bread and Chocolate in Pondicherry? Do you know Subco in Bombay? I was like, not really. Who are they? And I started looking out that, all right, these brands exist, but I was still the black wheat farmer. And one fine day, get this message on website from Daniel that I'm this baker. I saw your Instagram ad, because I was running a few at that point in time. Can we source your flour and see what is it all about? And turns out in 3 or 4 weeks of trials and time, it's like, this is the best bread wheat I've come across in India. And that really flipped my head. I was like, thanks, Daniel. I don't know what you mean, but I'm going to go on with it now. So
that was the turning point where you decided that was 3-1 is where I want to
put my time. Because that sort of a validation, even though I really didn't know, and I was very, very transparent and open about it. Black wheat was one thing, and there was this another fancy wheat, which was again heavily marketed, and it was called the baking wheat for the Indian industry. Again, enough data available on it, and we'd grown it as well. And then there was durum wheat as well for pasta that was there. So these were 3 varietals that I had for the first year. Very, very small scale. But yeah, when he said that, I was like, there is something that needs to be discovered. And I got really serious after that point in time and started talking to a lot of bakers, cold messaging. Like, there was this period of 1 week where I was like, okay, if Daniel is saying that this is the best bread wheat out there, maybe I should speak to a lot more people and understand and take their feedback. And through those conversations, what came up was that even the white flour, the maida that they get from their mills, it's not consistent. Then there is this fancying around imported flours. There are all these technical words and names which are going on. And it became very clear in, I think, the following months. I wouldn't say there was a single point. There were a lot of epiphanies on the way as I started delving deeper, that it's a systems problem. It's the entire supply chain where things are falling off the trail. So how do you deal with that? And the only way to deal with that is bringing everyone together, which is the hardest thing to do. But that was the only way.
So what are a couple of the points within the supply chain?
So in this entire wheat value chain, it starts with the right varietal. Because one of the major questions that everyone had in mind, or there was this notion that India does not have high protein wheat, which by part is true, like because we have 500 varietals of wheat in India. No one knows. Everyone knows atta, maida, and that's the beginning and the end of it. In Bombay, people know khapli and sharbati or anything that comes from MP. So they call it MP wheat. But that's about it, really. When you talk about wheat from Punjab, they say Punjab ki wheat to zahar hai. So that was one thing that we faced, really, to explain that, oh, it's coming from our farm, it's grown in a certain way, and all of those agri practices really make a difference. So that was the battle point. But to find out why is the wheat protein lower, why are people complaining, you go back to the agri universities. So I started developing my relationships with the scientists in the agricultural universities and started talking to them about it. And it turned out that, yes, they are right. 90% of wheat in India, which means 450 varieties out of 500, I'm just throwing a number out there, are made for chapati, because we are a chapati eating nation. So 10 to 12% protein is where we end up with. And also, these are high yielding varieties. So at farm level, there is an inverse relationship between the yield and the protein percentage. Higher your yield, lower your protein. Because protein is a function of nitrogen. So there's that complex scientific relationship that goes on. And only that 5% that's left over, there are a few varietals, 5 to 7 tops, that can be grown for high quality bread, pizza, or like this entire segment. So that's what we picked up. This baking wheat that I'm talking about, we just got lucky. Because it was marketed like that, and only when I went to the drawing board to understand why did he say what he said, it turned out that the genetics of wheat have to play the most critical role. So you have to select a varietal and work with that. And eventually, after 3 years, I realized that that's what the norm is in the global north. Like in Europe or in US, any artisan bakery, they know which varietal, which farm. So there's this end-to-end traceability. So there are 3 factors to it. One is the genetic component. So you choose the right varietal. Think of it in terms of coffee, cacao, wine, cheese, and it becomes very clear to you. Second part is the environment, which means what is the terroir, what is the kind of soil, water, micronutrient that you're giving it, what kind of sunlight, temperatures are there. Then the third part is the post-harvest management. Once you procure it, how are you storing it? The FCI, which is Food Corporation of India wheat, is stored under the open sky. You just put it in boris, which is jute bags, and you cover with the black plastic, whatever, poly on it. And if the wheat is going through these extreme moisture and temperature variability throughout the year, of course, if your input is screwed up, how will your output be consistent or even good enough? This is that supply chain. So we really picked the right varieties through these interactions in every segment. Then goes the farming practices, right? So in the beginning, we were growing at our farm, but now I work with 5 to 6 farmers. So if I have to draw a contrast here, it's really, in coffee, you need micro lots, right? You can work with micro lots, and that's what brings the diversity into everything. And then the processing side of it. In wheat, you need macro lots, because the industry thrives on consistency. So you have to have a big enough patch of a land to grow it. So the minimum land holding that we work on is 10 acres, but it goes up to 100 acres as well, so that we have a uniform product throughout the year. Because I'm not a trader, I don't pick wheat and sell it. I grow it, procure it, store it, give proper care, then the milling practice. So all of that. So first part is the scientists getting the right seed, then the right farmers, the right land, the agri practices, which is a 6 months process from November to April. Then we procure it, then you have to store it under the right temperatures. For wheat to perform consistently throughout the year, you have to give it air, like you have to clean it thrice a year. so that because any grain stored in bulk will produce heat. So let that
Yeah.
heat go out, you have to like give it air and turn it around 3 times a year. And the softer and the sweeter wheats are susceptible to infestation, the weevils, which emerge from inside out. There's no external thing happening. The weevil, the insect, lays the egg when the flowers are there. So the eggs are always inside the grain. They're just waiting to be activated to go through their entire cycle from egg to pupa,
Cool.
larva. And the weevil emerges from inside out. They will finish all the endosperm, which is the white starchy part, and then come out. So you will just see the shell, the bran. It's quite ingenious.
Yeah.
Like nature surprises you, and this is exciting. I hate them. But
When you began,
Hmm.
right, you obviously began by choosing, for example, initially the black wheat seed
and the bread
and then
wheat.
the
The bread wheat, the baking wheat,
the
that I'm-
baking wheat
and the
seed.
durum one. Yeah.
Where did you? So you found the reports, the research papers online, and you chose them based. You chose these 3 varieties based on the research papers.
Yeah.
But where did you actually source the seed from? Was that through your like?
Also, seed sourcing is really not an issue when it comes to wheat because it is given to you by the agricultural universities. And then there are seed traders because wheat is the top 2 crops, rather, not even top 5, like the crop in the country. There's enough seed available for all the popular varieties which are released through bigger universities. And this was released by PUSA IARI, which is Indian Agricultural Research Institute in Delhi. So it was released for the entire nation. Anyone. So the accessibility of seeds was not really an issue. You could readily look up online, get the seed and grow it. So that was the thing. However, now after 3.5, 4 years, I've realized that in India, wheat has a cycle. Every 2 to 3 years, the varieties which farmers favor keeps changing. So then it becomes really hard. Like if I'm growing a particular variety and that is what is worked for everyone and is giving me this highest quality and quantity of protein, as I scale, I need to have enough farmers growing that for me. So it's like, and because then no one else will grow because they've moved on. They moved on to some other varietal. So the challenges of scale are very, very different in this business as opposed to anything else.
But let's say, for example, what is your deal like with the farmer? If you've told them that, hey, like, let's say you're giving me 10 acres of land,
Sure.
and you're growing, let's say black wheat,
Sure.
right? You're growing black wheat for me. Now you have the demand, right? Like
Yeah.
that's why I'm making the deal with the farmer.
Yeah.
So if I'm a farmer, I'm like, okay, yeah, next year also I'll grow black wheat for you because you're
Sure.
buying my product.
Right.
So why would I need to move on to something else?
Is it like the other farmer?
It's a bunch of things. It's a bunch of things. One is because the returns are tied to the yields, right? So any high yielding variety, the varietals that we work with are not high yielding varieties, which means for every acre, I'll have to give at least a 8 to 10,000 premium just to match. Not the premium actually, just to match. That's the gap. So imagine when it happens for like till now we've been able to do it because our scale has also been up until 70 to 100 acres. But this year we've moved on to 250 acres. Now 250 into 10,000 is what you pay just to match the gap. And then there's a premium. And then there's a cost associated with procurement, storing, cleaning, processing. And that's why the story is so much more complex to explain when someone says maida to maida hai. So because they could essentially just add anything to it, enzymes, improvers, vital gluten, all sorts of chemicals to make it behave the same way. But we have to look beyond the functionality of things. We have to look beyond that and look at the entire ecosystem. How is it impacting? Because to achieve those higher yields, farmers also have to employ certain agricultural practices, which means adding more chemical fertilizers, which means adding more pesticides or whatever. It becomes a high water intensive crop as well. So there is so much, and it's almost like an entire domino that you're trying to tweak at every stage and play this nuanced dance on everyone's boundaries. So then comes the procurement, we store it, and then there are two ways to process wheat: stone milling and roller milling. Stone milling is when you put the entire grain in a stone chakki atta, what we call, and you get the entire flour out as a whole wheat flour. And then depending upon how you want to use it, you can sift it through a finer sieve, and that will, every degree of fineness will change the functionality of the dough altogether. The amount of water it will be able to absorb, the kind of product that it will be used for will completely change. For example, if I sift a flour through, let's say, 150 micron sieve, it's best suited to make a sourdough loaf. But if I sift it through 105 micron sieve, just 45 micron, it's like the radius of your hair hair strand. That's the difference. Just to put things in perspective, your hair is 75 micron thick. Just with that difference, it would be used for a ciabatta or a baguette. But because it's not apparent to a human eye, and that's where really diving deep into the science and working with experienced bakers and people who understand what we're trying to do becomes very, very pertinent. And the second way of milling wheat is roller milling, which is where you see the big factories, the big plants who are able to do anywhere between 40,000 kg grains a day to 250,000 kg grains a day. India produces 115 million tons of wheat every year.
I can't even comprehend that number.
115 and 9 zeros.
That's insane.
Yeah, so that is the amount of wheat we produce, and 70% of it is converted into chakki atta, and 30% of it is processed into fine white flours, refined flour, maida, in these very big mills. So that's what produces all of your Italian and French flours, very, very mechanized in nature. And you change the amount of bran and germ, the fiber component, the mineral vitamin component, by small percentage points, and the product changes. That's where your Italian type 00, type 0, type 1 come into picture. In French terms, your T45, 55, 65, T80, 150 comes into picture. All you're really doing, and these are not flours, like type 00 doesn't mean a pizza flour. It's telling you how fine the flour is. What it is to be used for depends on which wheat you're milling to that grade of milling, that grade of fineness. So that's a big thing to battle, because people think of a T45 and they think of a pastry flour, but T45 could very well be a pizza flour. Because it's that fine. So I mean, it's a lot, because India does not have a strict classification system of its own. We rely on Italian classification, or a French classification, or an American classification, which is, the way they talk about it is really hard red spring wheat, hard white spring wheat, or a winter wheat, and then the protein percentages. So it's really that, okay, you're looking at 3 different countries and everyone has a different context. So it's almost like Elephant and the Blind Men. That's the story here. Whosoever has learned whichever part becomes their entire context. And what we're trying to show everyone is the entire elephant. I think that would summarize my story. So that's how like it nuanced it gets, and it's only been a byproduct of the process, this knowledge and understanding. I wouldn't have even been able to tell you this 2 years ago. Like, you have to just like go through 400 research papers and talk to probably 1,000, but at least 50 bakers from India and across the world to reach that point. And then it's still very, very hard to implement it on the ground. So we started with 3 wheats. This season I've grown 14 varietals.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
And that's going to be the most diverse sort of a wheat farming setup, not just in India, but I can say across the globe as well. No farm is doing 14 varietals. And we have the level of backward integration to a point that if you want to make a ramen noodle, I'd grow that wheat, which is specifically for that. Do you know? So this is a fun fact. Australia has the entire wheat breeding program to cater to Southeast Asia's noodle market.
Oh, wow. Damn.
It's
Quite cool.
It-
So they supply the seeds then.
they do the seed, they do the wheat research, they develop the varieties, they grow the wheat, and then they can supply the grains or the flour. That doesn't matter. That depends on the economics of distribution. But that kind of backward integration, that okay, where is the market going? What do they really need? Because now for you to make, let's say, a noodle, you would want to use maida, and you would want to add a tapioca starch or a potato starch and a vital gluten to get that bounce in the bite and a bunch of other things. I'm not a technical person like that in terms of F&B, but you'd have to do a lot of stuff to it. And I'm like, why can't we bypass all that and just grow a high quality wheat, which as an out and out flour without adding anything to it would solve your purpose. It solved the farmer's purpose because it's biodiverse and it's a niche product. So we can command a premium and we can transfer that to the farm level. And in the process of connecting this side, like end user to the grower, is where I think we exist. So whoever comes in between, even if it's 5 stages, I would want to bring everyone together. And I mean, we have a kind of understanding and relationship with agricultural universities now, basis the personal relationships, that we know where the research is going, what kind of markets that they're looking at. And where my work comes in is like, can you give me a 2 kg sample so that I can get it milled and get you the feedback from the best baker and the chef in the country? Is it even worth it? Like, if you're looking for a mass commercialization, can we help you bypass that 7-year process, 2 or 3 year process? Because to release any wheat varietal in India, it's a 7 years journey. Small location trials, multi-location trials, they have to match certain yield criteria year on year. Then the second priority is really that, are they resistant to certain kind of stresses, biotic and abiotic, which could be the insects, pests and all that category, and certain diseases also that wheat is susceptible to. And then comes the nutritional and the functional side of things. So we're trying to change the priorities a little bit. And if we could, let's say if they're growing a soft wheat, that could really change the market. Right now, I would say 90% of the people doing cookies and cakes in the country rely on pre-mixes. You get a powder, you put water, and your bake's there. And you might think, oh my God, how beautiful is this blueberry cookie? So we're really trying to change that, because for us, like for me specifically, looking at it from a whole systems perspective, it has huge public health implications. Imagine what the country's public health systems are going to pay for in 10 years' time. How can we avoid that through these tiny things? And the entire ecosystem is aligned. Right now, there is so much dissonance, that's the right word, between the production systems and the consumption systems. The farmer doesn't know where their produce is going, consumer doesn't know where it's coming from.
Yeah.
And in between, there are a bunch of people. And if they all could be aligned in doing good business, I think that would sort of change a lot.
There's a lot of like education also required, because like someone that's just consuming on a regular wouldn't even know all the technicalities behind like creating the flour that they are consuming. So it's that perspective. And I feel like a lot of research is available, but I think like, the question is the complexities of it all is why it's not mass produced, I'm assuming, given that like you literally listed so many steps and things that people have to do, that is not as easy to be like, okay, today I want to also start black wheat farming and things like that. But I feel like from like the experiences that you've done, this is like the most long-standing one that you've had. And we can very much see your passion behind it and like the science behind it. But is there something that you've done differently this time around that has become the reason why this has stayed, whereas the other 2 that you've previously done were closed down?
Definitely. I think I've moved on the opposite side of the spectrum. As niche and small scale that the Baby Spa could be, or the silk clothing company, specifically natural silk clothing company could be, it is on the opposite side. So one thing became very, very clear, that the definition of impact is scale now, which wasn't earlier. And everything that we're looking at is just looking at the market first. is there a real genuine need, and is that need big enough? If those two tick, then how does this translate to the entire value chain? And then how feasible it is to do it in a 3-year period, because agriculture is a 3-year, like any new thing that I have to put in the market is a 3-year cycle. For example, we wanted to grow our own rye. Currently in India, rye is only grown in Himalayan region, upper Himalayan region, small holding farmers. The demand and supply is like out of whack. Rye is sold anywhere between 800 rupees to 1,000 rupees a kg in retail.
Oh.
And the global prices are way lower, way lower. And so we started with a small test batch. We grew like 1/4 of an acre last year to see will this adapt, because with plants, adaptation is a huge thing through a new agroclimate. It sort of worked, and this year we grew it in 1 acre. The crop's looking beautiful, so it's gonna be a successful crop. But yeah, the first year when we got the harvest, we did a bunch of trials with our closest partners, that it's not for commercialization, but you try it, give us the feedback, what kind of products could be done with it. So the strategic partnerships really play or have played the most important role in my journey, or 3-1 Farms journey, like that. It's like you're held by the community, and they are supporting you each step of the way, that do it, we are there. And this year we're going to work with just 3 partners, because we are responsible for their annual supply. So it's almost like coffee state business now. You're allocating what you're growing to different brands and partners, and how I can't do transactional business. As transactional as wheat as a commodity business is, I think we've done it in a completely opposite way. For me, it's a hospitality business. And I work very, very closely with our partners. We're working with over 50 brands as of now. And I have like a folder for each one of them in my drive. And it's a shared folder where, what's your vision? How's your brand doing? Where do you want to take it? How can we strategically integrate with you and make you stand out in that market, in your product category? So that is the kind of time and investment across the scale, because pizza, you can't think it's healthy, right? But when you're doing bread, it's healthy. Vinyosary, like croissants, would be consumed in a context with coffee. So the context changes. When you're looking at flatbreads like chapati, the context is different. It's wheat everywhere. But the context in which you consume changes the story, the narrative, how you're going to process it, mill it, and use it. So it's a lot, but this is what is the most exciting part. And when you look at scale, wheat is as scalable as it gets.
Especially in a country like India.
And
very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, we are also looking at the Middle Eastern market and Southeast Asian market. I've sent our flours to 7 different countries, bakers who are very, very experienced and are working with French, Italian, and American and Canadian wheat. And we've gotten like a yes, or like a really good feedback in terms of, we do stand comparably. So that's like global standard. I mean, to put Indian wheat on the map, it's going to be that 1 decade or 1.5 decades journey. But when that happens, like, how can you be the second largest producer of wheat?
I was just gonna say that. Like, how are we not already on the map, given how much we are producing?
Like, how can you be the second largest producer of wheat in the globe and not have a say in all these food products in some sense?
It's time for you to start your own grading system, because we can't do the French and Italian ones anymore. But I guess going back to the big story of how the name of 3-1 Farms came about. So if you can tell us how that happened.
Well, it comes from a very, I think, a deeper place. Again, very systemic. So if you, now when I say it, it'll become very apparent. You see daughters in India, right? It's always like 2 daughters and a son, 3 daughters and a son. And it's that narrative that flows across the geography, like north to south, east to west. You see this pattern, and I'm sure there's a documentary also on it, Unwanted Daughters of India, something like that. So for us, it was always 3 and a 1, because I've known through my parents' stories that entire, I would say, societal, cultural background that I come from, having a son is really important. It's almost like you don't have children till you have a son. So while growing up, it was not that they wanted to make us feel a certain way, but there was enough family pressure to have a son. And that's why, like, me and my brother, 15 years of trying is a lot of trying. And even with my youngest sister and the brother, they have a 10-year age gap.
Wow.
Right. So it becomes very clear it's 3 and 1. Not that they made us feel like that.
Yeah.
They did the best that they could. They provided us the best education that one could have. Even while growing up, the narrative was that till you are not independent, don't think of marriage. Otherwise, it's the opposite. The moment you turn 18, we will marry you off. But with our parents, the story was be independent and then only think in this direction. And till now, like, I don't really have any pressure to have a partner or be married or have children and things like that. But just taking that social narrative that is there. It's entire. I think it's a global narrative like that. So that's why it was 3 and 1. And whenever he comes, someone meets, I'm like, he's the one.
The one. To be honest, my family is the same. I have 2 older sisters, and I always believed that I was an accidental child.
You did?
Yeah. Like, my thought was, why would someone want 3 kids? Forget 1, 2,
Yeah.
why 3 kids?
Yeah.
And so my father, his justification has always been that, and he always starts it by saying, don't jump at me. These were the norms in our time.
Yeah.
It is not true today, but in our times, that people used to say that, it is the male child that will carry on the business, etc. So you need to have...
Who will carry on this land? That was the thing for us. Yeah.
So we have, within our family, we have again 3 sisters and a son also. We have 2 sisters and a brother. So it's like, I totally, like, I get what you mean down to my bone.
Yeah.
It's like so true.
So that became the brand name 6
Well,
years
that's
ago.
awesome. That's a crazy story to have as a brand.
Yeah, so I don't.
Personal one.
Yeah, I don't really talk about it in this context. I think this is first time I've spoken publicly in some sense about it. It's always like, we're 3 sisters and a brother, and it's a cute farm.
It's
So
a family business.
that's where the story comes from.
Awesome. All right, so let's go to our next game. So we've got 3 more games for you. This one's called 2 Truths and a Lie. The idea is you give us 3 statements, out of which 2 of them are true and 1 is a false statement. It can be challenges, achievements, it can be personal, all related to 3-1 farms. You give us the 3 statements and then we have to guess which one is the lie.
All right. I am co-authoring 3 research papers on agriculture. We supply wheat flour to Adani household. And I think this one's very clear, but I would just say Subco was our first B2B client.
You have a guess? I don't know. I'm trying to think.
I would say the lie is that you supply wheat to the Adani household, given that you're more of a B2B business. But
We reached there, we got an inquiry.
oh, really?
Oh, so then that
But
means...
it's still a lie. She didn't produce
It's
that.
still
Yeah.
Oh, it's still a
Still
lie. Okay.
I was going to
Good
say I
guess.
got invited to give a speech at FAO of UN about wheat agriculture. But that will also happen.
But 3 research papers, that wasn't even a question. I was like, okay, that's true.
Yeah, I'm sure.
No, because if I would have had to say, if I wouldn't have told you the story, I would have just said that 3-1 Farms brand story is an anti-patriarchy narrative. And you couldn't have guessed that.
Yeah.
You couldn't have guessed
Fair.
that. So
We got ahead of the curve.
Exactly, you asked that
but
question.
given that she mentioned, like, because Dani, linked it back to 3 sisters and a
My
brother.
brother, right.
And because of my, like, I know this entire
Right.
thing of,
Yeah.
older sisters, younger brother, and everything. Maybe we'd have gone.
Oh,
there.
you could
Maybe.
Maybe.
Tiny wee bit.
I mean, I think one of the reasons we would have gotten there is because it's so random. It'll be like, that's too much of a lie to be like, okay. But okay, if we move on to our next game, it's called Red Flags. We're going to give you 3 situations. In each situation, there are 2 things that are going good and 1 not so good, which is the red flag. And then you have to choose which situation you would rather be in. We've adapted these situations for you and 3-1 Farms, and you have to assume these to be true.
Okay.
So situation 1, 3-1 Farms has more than 1,000 monthly returning customers. You are in the process of raising funding, but quite a few of your recent customers have complained of receiving subpar flour from 3-1 Farms. Situation 2, 3-1 Farms has uplifted the lives of more than 100 farmers. You are now directly exporting to foreign wholesalers, but you personally haven't been able to take a break in over a year. Situation 3, your newsletter has more than 50,000 subscribers. You are being featured in Forbes 30 under 30, but a neighboring farmer has put a legal claim on your farmland due to an old land dispute.
Sure. I'd be in situation 2. It's a no-brainer. I anyway haven't taken a break in 3.5 years.
I was scared of putting that on the red flag
So
because I thought
that's
that
a
would be
given. That's a given. There is no Sunday. Sometimes I'm in these situations where I'm like, okay, let's talk tomorrow at 4 p.m. And they're like, oh, tomorrow is a Sunday. I'm like, oh,
Oops.
because I mean, when you live at the farm, you're seeing same 10 people for 300 days a year. There is no, and you work 7 days a week. So there is no concept of Sunday, Monday. You take a break when you really need it. And mostly you can't have it. So,
Fair enough.
but if I had to choose between the other two, I would go in situation 3 because currently I'm working with anyway enough farmers, I could change the land anyway. Like I'd be like, okay, all right, we'll move our operations to somewhere else. I can't take subpar flour. I would die before I produce subpar shit. So
Fair enough.
So
I mean,
this
that's
is-
also literally your MVP. Like, it's your main thing that you're trying to do.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
taking that away would be cruel.
very cruel.
And it's a competitive market, right? So you never know that like when you might lose someone just because of one bad
Yeah,
experience.
yeah. So our hedge, honestly speaking, is agriculture. It is the agriculture because it is the hardest thing to do. And specifically with climate change, every year we lose 30% of a crop. It's a given. I don't even question it. For example, last year we had hailstorms in second half of March. Imagine you have like a beautiful standing crop of wheat, and then there are hailstorms, and it's the
God.
time when wheat develops this floury part, the starch and the protein part, and it's all lodged, like it's fallen down, right? So you're losing that in terms of quality, in terms of quantity. The year before that, we had the hottest March in 125 years. We had no canal water and the grains were shriveled because the heat wave came in when the flower formation happens. So I just take it for a given, and we account for it in our pricing, we account for it in our farmer premiums, and we account for it in terms of when we're choosing a certain varietal, that is it heat tolerant? What can it really do and how much can it really do? So it's really like if it impacts a farmer, it's going to impact the consumer. And right now that's what's not happening. Farmers don't have an insurance, and in economic terms they take that burden. And consumers, because India is such a country that you can't have inflation going crazy, so all the policies, everything is from a consumer's perspective. So I don't get the mathematics when, let's say, and it's only the farmers of Punjab and I would say Haryana that the MSP is there and it's been procured by the government, and there's certain income assurance. All farmers want is an income assurance and not like MSP just a vehicle to enable that. Whereas in UP, Uttar Pradesh, you could go and you could buy wheat for 18 rupees a kg. You could buy at cost because there is so much excess supply and farmers don't have a leverage. They have to sell. If the crop's being harvested, they have to sell. They can't even take back home. So if those are the economics, that if UP produces 35% of the country's wheat and those farmers don't really have a say because it's small holding and bunch of things, right? Are you really eating the right flour? And whose pocket are you really eating out of? So, I mean, there's so many narratives, and I really think of at some degree, some level, what we're trying to do is this, wealth only flows one way. So we're trying to bring social equity by changing its direction a little bit wherever we can. and having everyone sort of be a stakeholder and a partner in some sense. I never call people vendors and clients. I can't use that language. That framing really annoys me. Whenever someone calls me a vendor, I would call their founder. I'll be like, I think your team needs to address me better or our team in a better manner. We're not vendors, we're partners, stakeholders. So, the way you frame things really impact your psychology. So, yeah, long one again.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Let's go on to our last game. This is
Sure.
called Rapid Fire, self-explanatory.
Right.
How many all-nighters did you pull in your first year of 3-1 Farms?
I am an insomniac. I cannot sleep. It's very hard for me to sleep, to shut the brain down. So I would say 50% of the year.
Wow.
For sure. 50% of
But
the
I get that. Even for me, it's very tough for me to...
Like even at farm, when after 8, all you can hear is the clock ticking and some crickets just like doing their sound, and you still can't.
Yeah, I would assume you are having like the best night's sleep on a farm with no like disturbance or anything. But no.
No, because you can't shut the brain off. You're like constantly on from 6 a.m. till 11 p.m. And so I need to do better. It's nothing about the farm.
We already answered this next one. How many days of leave have you taken in the last year?
Well, under 50 in 3 years. So
Wow. What is the scrappiest thing that you have done to build your business?
I've sifted the flour.
Nice.
Packed the flour, sat on the floor, done end to end. Like, gone to the chucky, got it milled, sifted myself, packed it, went to DTDC's office, everything end to end. I have done
to
it.
the courier.
Down to the
Nice,
courier.
Nice.
Ensuring, tracking it for them, sending them. Yeah.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
What is your favorite 3-1 Farms product?
There could be a few, but I really love rye, specifically because it's an openly pollinated crop. So when it is in the fields, the flowers are literally hanging out from the head or the stalk, and it invites so many pollinators. You have bees, you have ladybugs, you have butterflies, you have those small snails, slugs moving up. It's the most beautiful sight. So that's why I love it, because it sort of does a lot for the farm health. And wheat, the rye really doesn't need much of an input. The roots go really deep and the plant goes 6 feet up high, very thin stalks. So it's a sight. It's a sight. And it's also that scrappy story of growing a seed from 1 kg. I have many of those. I've smuggled so much.
Super cool. What is your favorite 3-1 Farms partnership till now?
Partnership till now, I would say, if it's about favorite, of course it's a given that it's Subco, but I think Chef Alex is my favorite person in the world. He is the favorite person in the world. Like, he would call and he would be like, how are you? And not in the going. Like, it's not for the past. It'll be like, how are you? So you have to really tell, how are you? Right? And then...
And that's when you first, that's like you don't ask yourself also. Like, you don't generally ask yourself, oh, how am I doing? But like,
he
Alex
would
calls you and you're like,
genuinely want to know. So you got to take 5 to 7 minutes out and tell what's going on and what you're doing, what you're not doing, and what's bothering you. And then we talk about work a little bit.
That's very sweet.
Yeah.
What has been your proudest moment with 3-1 Farms?
Till now, I think recently I was invited by the university where they awarded 10 farmers from the state who were improving the agricultural biodiversity, crop diversification. And I was the only girl. I was the only person under 30. And all other farmers who came, they had like white beards. So
Wow.
it was so beautiful that, all right, like, something has happened in these 3 years when you've done something. And now, like, these farmers who look at you as their daughter or as their granddaughter, and how things could be different, and they're always like, let us know if we can grow something for you. So currently I can happily say that I can make 5 calls and there'll be 500 farmers ready to grow anything that I want them to grow in Punjab, like,
That's
legibly.
crazy.
So it was a beautiful experience.
I feel like I know the answer to this, but did you ever question whether it was worth it?
Oh, I did.
Yeah.
I did. Because most of the time, like in the beginning, it did feel like you're shouting these things in a silo. You're the only one in a lot of ways, and you're like, because everything, a lot of it, I think, comes down for people to very transactional terms as well. Oh, but I'm getting my meda at 40. Why should it be 50? Well, we had 2 hours conversation about it. So those are, and not that it's going to impact their bottom line or anything like that. Per product change, like just in purely economic terms, is not something that they can pass on. Is not something that would really change their unit economics. But still, people have like, I was like, why don't you get it? It's literally for everyone. I'm not doing it just because, like, what? If I had to make money, I wouldn't be in agriculture. I'd rather, be some in consulting business or whatever, things like that. So you really have to look at the bigger picture as opposed to a tail or a limb of the elephant. And that's where I think the biggest challenge is, because they're ready to pay what, $350 a kg for a pizza flour from Italy. And then they're questioning something that we do, let's say 150 rupee a kg, that why? I'm like, if this is maida, then that's also maida. If you can tell me the difference, then yeah, for sure. But yeah, they can't. So,
What is the weirdest place from where you worked?
I would say washroom. So
That's
yeah,
classic,
but
yeah.
under the cot, under the cot, very tiny corners of the house were like, don't bother. Like right now, because I mean, what has really worked in some way is that, I stayed 9 to 10 years in Delhi, and you have a certain lifestyle. And now, after this 13, 15 years of sort of a gap, you go back to the farm. And it's almost like a cultural shock. You went because it was pandemic, but then what you wear, where you go, like there's permission to be taken, somebody to accompany you.
Yeah.
So that was like a bit of a shock, not a bit, but quite a bit. And then it's really, I think, but then what really happened, that because it was so isolating, I had nothing else to do but work. And no honking, nothing. You could work 16 hours a day and nobody to bother you. So that kind of focus, or just the, I would say, solitude that it allowed for, really, I think, helped me do the agriculture part. And then now it's like, okay, now I do believe that entrepreneurs are their biggest obstacles themselves, like their brain. And so it's like, I am my own obstacle. And what does 3-1 Farms need right now? And this needs me to be out and about. It doesn't need me to be at the farm now. So that's why now I'm here.
Fair enough. Have you ever felt like you let 3-1 Farms down?
Not really, but I always believe that I could have done certain things better, and with, like, I think it also just comes from a place where you have certain standards for yourself, and
Yeah.
then you impose those standards on everyone around you, right?
Yeah, that is a very tough trap for any entrepreneur. Like,
Yeah.
the reason why you're the business owner is because you do need to not see others from the same lens as you see yourself.
Yeah. So I think
Fair
in those spaces, things have happened where the expectations, reality versus expectations, was a thing. So,
What is your biggest fear in general?
in general, it's a single statement, but dying a meaningless death. Like we all are dying, but just like
Yeah, makes sense. Would you ever retire?
100%. I think there are these phases and stages. I'm like, all right, when I'm probably going to be upwards of 45, I want to be a venture capitalist. But when I'm upwards of 60, I want to be an art director.
You're multiple.
So retiring into another profession.
Yeah, I know a little bit of photography because my middle sister, she's a model. So I've literally done photography lying on the floor, getting the angles right. And the youngest one, she studied philosophy. She works in AI and Web3. That's sort of an intersection. So there's a bit of that as well, that all right, maybe philosophy of technology or ethics of technology could be a good business to get in 10 years down the line. Not 10, but because this one's not getting over before 20, another 2 decades, it sort of does need. But yeah.
All right. Which hobby of yours did your work kill?
I am able to read and write. I am that person who processes things by writing. So I'm a compulsive writer. But I could give a lot more time to reading across subjects. Yeah, so reading is something that
now
does
just
take a hit.
research papers.
It's just research papers. Yeah, a little bit of book reading goes here and there, specifically because I just read nonfiction. So yeah, that has
Alright.
taken a little bit.
So you prefer books over podcasts? That was our next question.
Yeah, because I'm that person who would scribble, make notes, emojis, fold papers, put some sticky notes. Like this book was read. The book
Yeah,
knows.
you can tell from far that this book has been read. Okay.
Yeah, so
Fair enough. iPad or notebook?
notebook for sure. Yeah.
Are you a morning person or a night owl?
Because of insomnia, I'm a morning person, but I would work better at night. But I think after the farm happened, the 4 years, everything has changed. So my best schedule is sleeping by 11 and waking up at 6:30 situation. Otherwise, I was also the same person who would sleep by 2 p.m. and wake up 8:39 and yeah.
Okay.
Which is true for most people living in tier 1 or metro. Most, not all, but yeah.
What's your favorite social media?
Instagram. I think that shouldn't be a question.
Fair enough. So that concludes our rapid fire segment, bringing us almost to the end of our conversation. Now, we ask every guest to ask our next guest a question. So we're going to have our previous guest ask you their question
Okay.
now.
So, as a founder, when you're completely focused on growth, when do you know how it's time to go slow or stop or take a break? Like, when do you know that for sure and take a conscious decision to sort of calm down for a while?
Wrong person to ask this question for sure. But I read this book, Unreasonable Hospitality, last year, and there was this chapter or a sort of an anecdote: slow down to speed up, and that stuck. So it's when you're too micro into things, just doing everything and all of that. I think that's really the time when you should step back. So I think when you're too zoomed in, it's the time to zoom out. When you're too zoomed out, it's the time to zoom in. So I think running across the spectrum is my favorite job. So yeah, but only slow down when you really want to speed up. So yeah, I think that's happened for
Nice
us
answer.
also. Yeah.
Cool. So that's the end of our conversation, Anushka.
Do
Thank
I-
you
do
so
I-
much for
Thank you for having
coming
me.
and giving us your time.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah,
Thank you for having me. It's been, I think, it's my first podcast. I can proudly say that I've been a guest on a podcast, and I've never shared 3-1 story in such depth with so much vulnerability and nuance and teeny bits here and there. So yeah, it's a pleasure. It's an honor, privilege.
it's
Thank you.
so interesting to learn more about this industry overall.
I could give another Gyan point. I love to give Gyan.